Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. The Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. This is a resource brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. My name is Austin McCormick. I'm one of the pastors of Covenant Baptist Church in Clarksville, Tennessee. I have another privilege to record a podcast with my co-host, Dewey Doval, one of the pastors of Emmanuel Reformed Baptist Church in SeaTac, Washington. And today we have the special privilege of welcoming our guest, Alex DiPrima, to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, brother.
Brothers, it's great to be on with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have some conversations with you before the show. Good to meet you. I don't think we've got to know you very much. We've seen you from afar on social media, and I suppose we could say a friend of Spurgeon is a friend of ours. We greatly appreciate Spurgeon, and the title of our conversation this evening, as we're recording, is Spurgeon and the Poor. This title comes from a book that you have written, published by Reformation Heritage Books. So we're excited to have this conversation with you about how the gospel compels Christian social concern. But before we jump into the content of your book, since you are a first-time interviewee, can you just spend some time introducing yourself to our audience?
So I have served in pastoral ministry for the better part of a decade. I live here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I didn't grow up here, though. I grew up in Miami, Florida, and then was in South Carolina, then the Raleigh-Durham area, where I went to seminary at Southeastern Seminary. I did my MDiv there, stayed on for doctoral studies. I studied under Nathan Finn there, and actually studied Spurgeon as part of my doctoral research. And have really enjoyed being able to write on his life and his ministry, and lecture from time to time on him as well. And so Spurgeon and the Poor was actually my first book, and it was drawing pretty heavily on my doctoral research, which was on Spurgeon's evangelical activism and how he was both a contributor to and exemplar of the broader trend among 19th century evangelicals to be engaged in social concern, as sort of an overflow of their understanding of the work of the gospel and its effect in the life of the believer and in the life of the local church. So I enjoy getting to study Spurgeon and get to promote him and draw attention to his remarkable ministry. And this book was a large part of that.
Well, as Austin rightly said, a friend of Spurgeon is a friend of ours. So we are so thankful to have you here on our program today, brother. We've had numerous conversations related to Spurgeon. We talked about having Dr. Jeff Chang on in the past on this program. I know Dr. Ed Romine as well has come on the program to talk about Spurgeon and a whole host of other people that I can't recall off the top of my head. But what I can say with a great degree of certainty is that I don't think we've ever discussed Spurgeon and the poor, this specific concern that you address in your book, Spurgeon's social concerns and how that ties into the gospel. Would you be willing just maybe to give us some of the backstory? You've alluded to it a bit in the introduction you just gave about who you are, but what led you really, or what motivated you to write a book of this nature?
Well, there were a few reasons I was drawn to this particular subject for my research, and why I eventually published a book. Now, the book is really not a republication of my dissertation. It's a popular level book aimed at pastors in the church. But the reason I was drawn to this area of study and wrote this book was I guess a few things. First of all, I became aware after years of knowing who Spurgeon was, having read a few biographies on him, certainly read lots of his sermons. I was not aware of the massive scale of his philanthropic efforts in London and really all over the country of England. So his dates are 1834 to 1892, as I'm sure many of your listeners may know. By 1884, so in the mature years of his ministry, he had 66 benevolent institutions operating out of the Metropolitan Tabernacle, the church that he pastored. He gave away millions of pounds over the course of his life, or what would be the equivalent of millions of pounds in today's dollars, or today's pounds, I guess I should say. He was engaged in rescuing orphans off the street, serving needy widows all over London, starting all kinds of benevolent ministries throughout different boroughs and districts and neighborhoods of London. Just a remarkable Christian philanthropist. And that aspect of his ministry was just largely unknown by most people who knew Spurgeon. So they know him as the great preacher of the Metropolitan Tabernacle. the Prince of Preachers, we like to call him. And yet he was known just as much as a philanthropist in his day in London as he was a preacher. And that aspect of his ministry is just, relatively unknown. So I was really wanting to expose that aspect of his ministry as really wonderful. More than that, a second reason I was drawn to Spurgeon in particular for the book was because I think Spurgeon brings together a really wonderful blending of evangelistic fervency and Christian social concern and weds them together in a way that I think represents well the imperatives of the New Testament with regard to social work and social ministry, loving neighbor, doing good among the poor, and that sort of a thing, from a sound gospel ministry grounded in a solid theological foundation. A third reason I wrote the book would have been, so it came out, I suppose, in 2023. I was writing at a time where I think evangelicals have really struggled on this issue of social involvement, and especially those of us in Reformed and Calvinistic spheres. How to understand the relationship between the gospel and social ministry is something that's been a little complex for us in our history, especially in the last 100 years or so, but maybe even especially in the last 10 years or so. This has been a matter of great debate among evangelicals. And so you've had brothers that came out with a statement on the social justice. Certainly in the last 100 years, there's been conversation about the social gospel. But there's been, understandably, there's been a lot of critique of how this kind of goes wrong in evangelical spheres. But there hasn't been a lot of forwarding kind of a positive vision for what evangelical social work ought to look like among those of us who are confessional, are Reformed, and Calvinistic. And so I saw in Spurgeon, I wanted to retrieve him as something of a model. He's certainly known for his confessional commitment. He's known for sound gospel ministry. He's known for his Calvinism. But at the same time, also known as this great evangelical activist, this great philanthropist, this great man involved in social ministry. And so wanted to hold him up as maybe a positive vision for how we might move forward on these issues as we continue to debate them in evangelical circles. So that's some of the background and what drew me to this field of research.
Excellent. Well, we could transition now into some of the content of your research and the content of your book when we want to ask you a twofold question. You've already began to address one of these questions with that last answer, but what did Spurgeon teach about assisting the poor, and how did Spurgeon and the ministries that he was involved in help relieve the needy?
Yeah, if I could put it simply, I think, in the world of social ministry, mercy ministry, and benevolence, there's a spectrum of views on what Christian involvement in that space should be. Spurgeon believed, for his part, that mercy ministry, benevolence ministry, good works of charity toward the poor and the needy, were not just preferential. Like if you get to this, great, but not necessary. No, rather, he believed they were essential to the Christian life and to the ministry of the local church. So he believed it wasn't an optional or preferential add-on that we throw into the church's ministry or the life of the individual Christian, but rather good works of love toward the needy, toward the poor, toward our neighbors. That was to be part and parcel of the Christian life. And he gets to that from a number of angles. I mean, he certainly gets that from many of the imperatives of the New Testament. We're to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we're told the great example of that is found in the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10, who attends to the physical needs of the bleeding man, the dying man. And Jesus tells us to go and do likewise. That's how we're to live. He finds it also in passages like Galatians 6, where we're told to do good to all, especially the household of faith. Or in Galatians 2, where Paul says he wanted to remember the poor. Or passages like Titus chapter 2, where we're told the Lord redeems a people who are zealous for good works. And in chapter 3, we're told those good works are works of essentially benevolence that help cases of urgent need. So all kinds of passages like this he's drawing on to try to make the point that Christians should be engaged in good works of benevolence and mercy ministry. Now, it's important to recognize this wasn't for him the kind of transformationist ethic. He did not think we would bring heaven to earth. He was a critic of socialism, Christian socialism as it's emerging in the latter 19th century. He's not thinking that we're going to do this primarily through political reform and putting our hands on the gears and levers of politics. He's more concerned, rather, like James is in the Bible, that we would practice true religion. And what is true religion? It does good to orphans and widows in their distress. He wants Christians to be known as those who help. We have been saved by the grace of God. The mercy of God ought to be merciful and gracious in our orientation toward others. We who follow the Lord Jesus Christ should follow in his example, who was always touched by the material needs, and of course the spiritual needs also, of those around him. We're to follow in his example in that. So for all these reasons and more, Spurgeon felt there is a duty upon us as believers, a responsibility we have to show forth the grace of Christ through benevolence work, through mercy ministry, through social ministry, not as a way of bringing heaven to earth and transforming the society into some, social utopia, but as showing forth the effect of the gospel in our own lives and commending Christ to those who are in need through our good works and through our mercy ministry. That would be more the approach that Spurgeon's going to take.
It sounds like a really healthy balance that Spurgeon was seeking to strike. You sometimes will have Christians that focus so much on the physical, so much on the material, so much on the benevolence that they never get to the gospel. And then on the other side of the coin, you have such an emphasis on we've got to reach people with the gospel. We don't want to distract from the gospel by engaging in benevolent acts or engaging in meeting the needs of people that have material needs or physical needs. So I really appreciate how you've given us an overview of Spurgeon's approach to striking that balance between both the physical and the spiritual in his ministry.
Well, and David, if I could just emphasize on that point, these things were very much wedded together for him. Gospel proclamation was always the central mission of the church for Spurgeon, to preach the gospel and build up healthy local churches. That's what Spurgeon wanted to do. But he saw benevolent ministry, mercy ministry, social ministry, we could call it, as serving gospel witness and as enhancing it, as adorning it, as sweetening it, and commending the ministry of the gospel to needy people. So they very much go together. And in those 66 benevolent institutions that Spurgeon started through his church, all of them in some form or fashion included gospel proclamation, or at least bringing people into collision with Christians. Very little of it was just, giving a bowl of soup and just doing a good act in and of itself. There was accompanying with it somehow gospel ministry of some sort or another, which I think is also instructive. Maybe now we think about, benevolent ministry today.
Sure. No, it's very helpful and very encouraging to hear as well. I wonder if we can transition now into another subject that gets to the core of some of your research in this book regarding Spurgeon's teaching on politics. You've noted some of the misrepresentations and misunderstandings that have been tied to how Spurgeon engaged in the political realm. Can you give us a proper assessment of Spurgeon's teaching on politics and maybe what's contributed to some of the misunderstandings that people have about how Spurgeon was engaged in these activities?
Yeah, well, this would be one of the unique contributions, I think, of the work that I've done on Spurgeon, and that is to try to dispel the rumor that Spurgeon was super involved in the political arena. So that what I regard as an error in terms of misrepresenting Spurgeon on that front, that he was a political preacher, as one of his biographers asserts. That's been propounded in some earlier biographies, and it's been propounded online in kind of popular format on social media as well. And I just think it doesn't hold up upon further scrutiny. If you actually study his sermons, if you actually study his articles in the Sword and the Trowel, you don't find in Spurgeon one who is especially fascinated with politics. What's more, there's hardly any political commentary in his sermons whatsoever. Occasionally, you will find him addressing a subject that he regards as a religious matter, a scriptural matter, that influences how people might think about politics in his day. The most famous example would be the slavery issue. He addresses slavery from the pulpit, but really as a matter of being a gospel minister and one who's trying to teach a consistent Christian ethic. He doesn't dive into political debates really at all in his context through his preaching, unless he's addressing some direct scriptural concern from the passage itself. That's really the only time he would address those issues. And in fact, he challenges those in his own day. He says, you could search through 18 volumes of the Metropolitan Tabernacle pulpit, and I challenge you to find 18 pages that even look to politics, that don't arise out of the text itself. And I think, although that's only a slight exaggeration, it is only a slight exaggeration. It's not far off. Now, outside of his preaching, I'll say one more thing about his preaching. In his classic work, Lectures to My Students, which are a collection of his Friday lectures to the men of the Pastors' College, the college he started to train men for ministry, He urges them not to bring politics into the pulpit. He views political preaching as a kind of a no-no when it comes to preaching in his day, and he discourages his students from. He regards it as kind of a bastardizing of the pulpit, or descending the pulpit into earthly matters, and not sticking with the main task of preaching the scriptures. But beyond that, he does have his monthly magazine, The Sword and the Trowel, which throughout his life had about 15,000 regular subscribers each month. That's where he's writing lots of articles on lots of issues, all kinds of topics, doing book reviews, writing articles on issues of the day, giving reports on various church plants out of the tabernacle or through the pastor's college. And he will, in The Sword and the Trowel, he's willing to address politics a little bit more in that forum. But even in that, there's something instructive. This was not Sunday morning preaching. This was not a ministry of his church. I tell people this is kind of like Spurgeon's blog, in his day, if you think about it that way. This is where he has this separate ministry, and he's trying to just inform and edify the Christian reader. But even there, he's fairly tempered, I think, in engaging in the political issues of the day. And he'll often only engage in issues that he regards as having a religious interest. And so I do think that's a correction that's needed in our day. Some have fashioned Spurgeon as almost like the 19th century version of Billy Graham. Billy Graham is almost like a chaplain to many of the presidents. He was known as America's president, or America's preacher, excuse me. I think it would be a terrible misrepresentation of Spurgeon to regard him as one who was heavily involved in politics. Now, he was friends with prime ministers. He was friends with William Gladstone, the prime minister. He does involve himself in one election in 1886. He produces a pamphlet. He believes that the election has to do with very serious religious concerns related to foreign wars that were going on and other things. And so there is one instance where he actually does try to influence an election, but for the most part, it's not heavily involved in politics. One more, I guess, mea culpa I'll put out there, not mea culpa, but one more piece of counter evidence I'll just acknowledge. Spurgeon was open and honest and transparent about his party affiliations. So he acknowledged, as a nonconformist, he was for the Liberal Party. There were the liberals and the conservatives. When I say he was a liberal, don't think like liberals and conservatives in American parlance today. Issues were very different in the 19th century. Many of the liberal values would line up very much with many conservative values in America today. But he was open about his vote. He would let people know that he voted for liberal candidates, but didn't impose that on other people in any kind of abrasive kind of a way. So yeah, there's a chapter in the book on Spurgeon on politics. If you want to read that more, some of the political issues that he spoke to. But on the whole, I think his interest in politics has been overstated by previous writers.
This has been helpful, especially, your unique contribution on the subject of Spurgeon and politics. You've mentioned several benevolent ministries that Spurgeon and his church was involved in, serving orphans, serving widows, and various other ministries. What would you say are some lessons that Christians in 2024 can learn from Spurgeon's example to do good to others whenever it's in the power of their hand to do it?
Yeah, the chapter in the book that I regard actually as the most important chapter is not even a chapter in the book. I suppose it's an appendix at the end of the book, where I try to situate Spurgeon in the broader Christian tradition. So after explaining this sort of explosive philanthropic ministry, benevolent ministry that Spurgeon had, I sort of asked the question, was he an anomaly? Was he unusual? And the argument I make is that he's not from the standpoint of Christian history. So one of the things I think we can learn from Spurgeon is Spurgeon saw what he was doing as obvious. He saw it as natural to New Testament Christianity. So being involved in helping needy people, serving needy people, being engaged in Christian benevolence and mercy ministry, he saw this as necessary, a necessary part of the Christian faith and faithful Christian practice. Again, not an optional or preferential add-on. Now, evangelicals today, this side of Walter Rauschenbusch and the social gospel and the advent of liberal theology, have become a little bit more gun-shy about social work and social concern. And I think there are understandable reasons for that. What you see at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century is a hollowing out in many institutions, many denominations, a hollowing out of orthodox doctrine in many Christian denominations. You have the emergence of modernism and liberal theology. which erodes Christianity of all belief in the supernatural, of bodily resurrection, of the virgin birth, of penal substitutionary atonement, and all these other cardinal doctrines that I think are at the heart of the Christian faith. And this is done in part to satisfy, I think, modernist tendencies and the scientific revolution and sort of the post-Enlightenment situation. Now, what that leaves many denominations with is a sort of sentimental love for neighbor. So you have Christian churches that are known, especially metropolitan areas, let's say in the States, for their social ministries. And they're seen as providing an overall kind of social good. But you get inside their churches, and there's nothing like true gospel preaching. There's nothing like faith in the cross of Christ and the blood of Jesus and the eternality of hell and heaven and all that. But there's a social ethic that's there, and that seemed to be the basic value of Christianity in the 20th century into the 21st century. And so conservative evangelicals over the last 100 years, I think, have tended to see a fascination or an interest in social ministry as an impulse of theological liberalism, which is why, brothers, I'm guessing in your churches, in my church, if you have a 19-year-old or 20-year-old college student and they're especially excited about like relieving hunger or something like that, you immediately get a little bit nervous because you're like, okay, where's this going? Is this guy or girl becoming theologically liberal or something like that? Why are they so passionate about social ministry? Because this side of the social gospel and the social justice movement of the last 100 years, we have seen where that can go. However, what I try to argue is that prior to those sort of social changes, historical changes, theological changes of the last 100, 150 years, what Spurgeon was doing was very normal. It wasn't seen as an impulse of theological liberalism. Rather, it was the norm for Christians for 1800 years. You go back to the earliest centuries of the church, you go back to the New Testament era, the apostles of the early churches they planted were engaged in helping the poor and doing good work. In the early centuries of the Christian church, among the church fathers, they were known as spectacular philanthropists. Brothers, the hospital was our idea. Christians came up with the hospital. The first hospital was a philanthropic organization. It was Christians saving children, orphans, abandoned infants from the infanticide walls in Rome and in places across the ancient world. It was Christians who were engaged in founding the first schools and in founding orphanages and promoting literacy and things like that. We are historically the people who help. We're the people who care. We're the people who see the bleeding man, and we stop and help him because we recognize we have a God who created man in his image, who calls us to love our neighbors, who has saved us by his grace and has given us an orientation of gracefulness and mercy toward others. And so throughout the story of the Christian church, this has been what we do. And Spurgeon, I think, was just sort of working that out in his own day in London, in the largest city in the world in his day. I do think there's been larger social historical trends that have understandably caused us today to be a little more hesitant about just going full bore after social ministry. And brothers, we could even go to the last sort of 10 years of the timeline here. The woke movement, the social justice movement, all this kind of stuff, things related to CRT and stuff like that, has made those of us who are more conservative and confessionally reformed a little more cautious when social ministry comes up. Okay, I understand that caution. And in another part of my ministry, I have contributed very much to the conversation that has led toward more caution on that front, okay? Especially when it comes to CRT and things like that, and social justice. But at the same time, brothers, we are called to do good to all. At the same time, we are called to love our neighbors. At the same time, we are called to be good Samaritans. At the same time, we are called to remember the poor. At the same time, we are called to give ourselves to true religion that cares for orphans and widows in their distress. These are New Testament scriptural principles that we're to live out in our own day. So I want to be a part, even as I issue cautions to some of the error I see, I should say, to my left. I don't know on the camera if it's to my left or right, but to my left, I want to issue cautions there. I also want to say to my confessionally reformed brothers on my right, brothers, there is a godly, positive, wholesome Christian vision to be found, both in the New Testament and I think in Flesh and Blood in Charles Spurgeon, that I'm trying to hold up to say there is a way forward on this front that doesn't sell us or the next generation or the one after that downstream to liberalism, but rather leads us into a vision of Christianity that is full of good works, zealous for good works, while not losing the heart of the gospel, but rather promoting it in a way that I think is winsome and inviting and attractive and bright for the next generation, and one that's grounded in sound theology. Sound, for this podcast, particular Baptist 1689 theology. I want to see wedded with that theology, a love for neighbor and a regard for the poor and needy in a way that is sound and biblical. And so that's what I'm trying to do with Spurgeon. That's what I think we can learn from him. This has always been our inheritance as evangelicals, as Christians throughout church history. And we need to find a way to do it in our own day that does not sell this generation or the one after downstream to theological liberalism. So that's, I think, the main goal I have with the book.
Well, I trust that will be a timely word of encouragement to our listeners, and would hope and pray that that would be all of our listeners' desire as Christians to fuel social concerns with the gospel of Christ and the love of Christ, that compassion of Christ that we see all throughout the New Testament for those who had very real physical needs or bodily ailments. And I just love hearing your heart and your passion for those matters, and it's clearly evident that you have spent a lot of time not only thinking about this issue from the perspective of Spurgeon, but also from the perspective of Scripture. So we're very thankful for that. And as we seek to wrap up this conversation, it's been such an uplifting time. Want to give you the last word. I don't know how you'll one up your previous comments there. It felt like we were enjoying a good, whether it be a Sunday school lesson or even a message from the pulpit, as it were. But, final word of encouragement, anything related to Spurgeon, anything related to how Christians should regard reaching the needy in society and showing the mercy of Christ as we do so, or anything related to what we've talked about today. We want to give you the opportunity to wrap things up.
I appreciate that, brother. I would just put in a plug here for your listeners, students, pastors, church members. Find historical heroes. Find friends from church history. Spurgeon, I'm grateful to have spent, I guess, about a decade now studying him on an academic level, studying him as a pastor, but just as a Christian. He has fed my soul and blessed me so much. In reading his sermons, in studying his biography, he has ministered to me in the most profound kinds of ways, through difficult seasons and trials, and in the context of ministering his word. And I'm just grateful to have him in my life, and I want to encourage more Christians out there. Invest in church history. Find friends from the past. The Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11 is just a sampling. The Hall of Faith there Hebrews 11 really doesn't stop. And in that passage, it kind of leaves it an open-ended. There's going to be more like this who live in this way according to faith, who are to be models for us, who are to edify us and stimulate us, that we might walk more faithfully in our day. And so I would commend Spurgeon as kind of a theological hero and a faithful brother from years past, but there's so many others throughout church history. Read church history for the good of your own faith and to help you to live faithfully in your own generation as you see how other brothers and sisters have done so in their day. That would be my parting word, last encouragement.
Very good. Take heed to our listeners. Be sure to check out this wonderful book that we've been discussing over the course of our conversation today, as well as some of the other resources that we have on Spurgeon with the Covenant podcast. We have many that you can peruse through our podcast library. We hope that you will be edified as you do so. Dr. DiPrima, thank you so much for our time together today. Thank you for your work, for getting Spurgeon resources out to the church at large, as well as just your service for Christ's people as a whole. We wish you nothing but continued blessings in your future endeavors.
Brothers, thank you for having me on. It's been a privilege.
Thank you very much. To our listeners, we thank you as well for your continued support of the Covenant podcast. Until next time, we wish you grace and peace. God bless.